I'd like to brief to you today a presentation that I call Emerging Strategic Landscape Implications for Defense Demand. This is an evolved version of a briefing I gave at the last annual meeting. Since that time, I have changed a lot of the charts and the numbers. I briefed it to the senior management of Lockheed Martin, BAE Systems, and the board of directors at Rockwell Collins, but this is the end. This is the last time I'm going to brief it, because elections change everything. And so this is my last chance to get it right. Next chart. So what is this brief about? Well, two forces, one internal to our nation and one external, drive all U.S. demand for military goods and services. First of all, there are the threats, which dictate priorities, which shape strategy, and which determine requirements. And then there are the politics, which provide the resources, but also limit options and impose conditions. Threats and politics don't just dictate the size of the defense budget, they dictate its composition, which is actually more important to us. Sheer scale isn't what we care about. What we care about is what's in the budget. So this brief is about trends and global threats and domestic politics that will drive defense demand for the remainder of the decade. Next chart. Let's start with a little bit of historic context. The Cold War that created today's defense establishment was really unique in U.S. history. Prior to about 1950, U.S. defense spending was about 1% of gross domestic product in peacetime. Wars were episodic, and so we didn't really spend enough money to sustain a dedicated defense industry. If war came, then we would mobilize the commercial economy for war production, and when it was over, we would demobilize. Well, that all changed in 1950 because of the threat posed by communism. Nuclear weapons that could destroy our nation literally overnight, conventional forces far bigger than those of the West, and brushfire insurgencies that were kindled throughout the developing world. So we spent a lot more money on defense during the Cold War, which kind of passed for peacetime, than ever before. 10% of gross domestic product in the 1950s, 9% in the 1960s, 6% in the 70s and the 80s. Without the Cold War, there would have been no need and no ability to sustain a military-industrial complex. Next chart. So here's a map of Eurasia, and it shows the commitments that we had during the Cold War. If you were to take all the various strands of our strategy and reduce them to a single word during that 40-year period, you would probably call it containment. Because the whole idea here was to surround the Soviet Union and its satellites with a web of bases and military commitments that would prevent the expansion of communism. So from 1950 to 1990, the United States really had an almost global military presence, which dictated the demand for a huge logistics and transportation establishment. U.S. forces were forward deployed in defense of NATO. The United States took over from the United Kingdom as the main protector of Persian Gulf oil. Afghan insurgents were funded to oppose Russian invaders. There was a continuous U.S. military presence in Korea after 1950. The U.S. nuclear umbrella extended over Japan. We countered Chinese pressure on Taiwan. And of course, we waged a 15-year counterinsurgency conflict in Indochina that was ultimately unsuccessful. Next chart. Well, the world has changed. The global military and economic landscape has been transformed since the collapse of the Soviet Union by new technologies and old rivalries reborn. The top 5 military developments during that period, well, you know, different people have different opinions. I would say they are the rise of global terrorism, the destabilization of the Middle East, the Russian pressure on Eastern Europe, the emergence of cyber threats, and more recently, Chinese military modernization. The top 5 economic developments, probably the digital revolution as symbolized by the internet, China's rapid economic growth, the globalization of the supply chain, the slowing of Western economies in Japan. Japan hasn't basically grown in 20 years, and the expansion of the welfare state. Maybe the most important trend since the collapse of communism is what you see in that center chart there, which is the shares of global GDP that the United States and China have. When the new millennium began in 2000, the United States was generating nearly a third of all global output. Not bad for a country with 5% of the world's population, but that has declined steadily to 22% today. Meanwhile, China, which joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, has seen its share of global wealth increase, global output increase from 3% to 15%. Now, some people think that these two lines are going to converge in the future. Personally, I don't believe that. You all know that China is slowing. But this was enough of a concern when President Obama took office that the National Intelligence Council warned him the transfer of wealth from west to east that was ongoing at that time was the greatest transfer of wealth between regions that had ever happened in such a compressed period in human history. If only that was our only problem. Well, we also have slow growth plus expanding welfare states in the West that have led to very heavy borrowing, unprecedented borrowing really, and also to a limited availability of funding for the military. This is a fiscal challenge that is not going away. The whole world is now aging, and it's going to be harder and harder to afford the obligations we have assumed. Next chart, please. So looking at that map of Eurasia again, you can see how things have changed and how instability has spread. Russian military pressure is being exerted in Eastern Europe. An Islamic caliphate was established by ISIS in the Middle East. Meanwhile, all the countries around ISIS are gradually, one by one, failing. All those borders that were drawn after World War I by the European powers are dissolving. Yemen, Somalia, Libya, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq. I mean, how many failed states can you have in a region before the whole thing collapses? Further to the south, we have ethnic and sectarian instability across sub-Saharan Africa. In the east, we have Iran pressuring US allies in the Gulf, and we have a seemingly interminable insurgency. I'm sorry to say, I think we all know how this insurgency is going to end. It's not going to be a good end for our interests. To the south of there, we have Indo-Pakistani tensions with nuclear potential because both of those countries are now in possession of significant atomic arsenals. North Korea is building its own long-range nuclear arsenal with the stated intention of being able to attack the United States, and China is challenging US dominance in the Western Pacific. This is a lot of threats, but what's particularly striking about it is that half of these threats were not anticipated by the Obama strategic guidance in 2012. That was the foundation for our current military posture, and yet ISIS wasn't part of the equation. Russian truculence, Russian aggression and belligerence in Eastern Europe, that wasn't in the plan. So we've got some problems here. Next chart. If you were to reduce to one word, just as I did the Cold War strategy, the Obama strategy during his 8 years in power, the word you would probably use is restrained. You will recall that the biggest single reason he was elected president was his opposition to the Iraq War. In fact, Hillary Clinton might have been the nominee in 2008 if she had agreed to a timetable for getting out. She wouldn't. And in the process, Obama got the nomination, and then he won the general election. His post-Iraq strategy stresses restraint and burden sharing, or as the White House calls it, partnering in US global commitments. And that strategy is laid out most authoritatively in the 2012 Strategic Planning Guidance and in the 2014 Quadrennial Defense Review. What does it say are the pillars of the joint force under the Obama strategy, this rebalanced joint force? Missile defense, nuclear deterrence, cybersecurity, space superiority, long-range strike, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, and counter-terror special ops. Well, as you can see, there's a few items missing here that would have been there during the Cold War. These highlights point to a reduced overseas military footprint, meaning fewer bases, fewer boots on the ground, and by implication, fewer requirements for defense transportation to get to the fronts. Now, this would have been a wonderful strategy if the threats hadn't proliferated in the vacuum that we created, but they have. Developments in Europe and the Middle East are just not cooperating with where the administration wanted to go. Next chart. Now, that suggests that we're not going to stay on the vector we've been on, but there's another bigger reason, grounded in history, for why we know our strategy is likely to change over the coming years. Look at all the colossal surprises that the world has presented us with over the last several decades that we just didn't see coming. I mean, take me. I was born at the end of the Truman administration. In fact, I just turned 65 last week. Look at what has happened during my lifetime that the intelligence community and policymakers failed to anticipate. 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, and in the process demonstrate they can reach America with ballistic missiles. Let's see, 5 years later, the Soviets tried to put missiles in Cuba, which would have given us almost no warning time in a nuclear attack. Not long after that, 6 years to be exact, the Tet Offensive in South Vietnam basically overthrows the political support in the United States for the Indochina War and erodes the support also for this broader policy of containment. In fact, within a few years, South Vietnam is overrun by the North. Huge military defeat, which is followed several years after that during the Carter administration by the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. We didn't really anticipate any of these things in our strategy, and so it's not surprising that we also didn't anticipate a dozen years later when the Berlin Wall falls down, and then the Soviet Union basically collapses. It dissolves. Not in the plan, right? Well, that was good news. A lot of people thought it was such good news it was the end of history. One noted think tank expert wrote a book called The End of Strategy. Well, not so fast. Then Iraq invades Kuwait. The 9/11 terror attacks occur. We invade Iraq and almost are defeated by a ragtag insurgency. Russia invades Ukraine, and ISIS declares a caliphate. So what am I driving at here? Regardless of which party wins the White House in 2016, U.S. defense strategy is likely to change in response to new challenges in the near future. It's nearly inevitable. Next chart. Well, with that by way of introduction, let's look at 2 pages of demand signals for major missions, starting with the big traditional missions. What I've done on this chart here is I've arrayed the overarching missions for the 3 military departments, and then at the top, the big strategic missions. And what we see is a mixed picture. Nuclear deterrence is clearly going to get more money because we thought we could trust the Russians when this administration started. We no longer believe it. So we're going to be replacing all 3 legs of the nuclear triad, plus the command and control system. Missile defense, on the other hand, you would have thought with Russia on the march, we would have been spending more money on defense of the homeland, but we're not. In fact, we spend 1/5 of 1% of the defense budget on defending the homeland against a nuclear attack, and almost all of that is oriented to North Korea. So the demand signal here, at least during the Obama years, has been negative. Homeland security, of course that goes forward, but without a major new domestic attack, probably it doesn't get increased. With regard to the Navy, the big missions, forward presence, sea control, those continue to be funded, maybe some shifts like moving forces out of the Persian Gulf into the Pacific, but the big increase, the big demand signal is for power projection. Why is that? Well, China, Russia, Iran, all those countries we could potentially reach by sea are implementing anti-access area denial strategies. Now, the Navy just said 2 weeks ago they don't want to use this term anymore because it describes too much diversity in a single simple-minded phrase. But be that as it may, that's where we're going to be putting the money. We're really concerned about getting there. With regard to the Air Force, the big 3 missions, not counting air superiority, are global strike, global mobility, global ISR, global reconnaissance. Global strike's going to be getting more money. It's not just that we're buying a new bomber, but one way or another, we're going to ramp up production of the F-35 fighter. Global ISR, we're going to be recapitalizing a lot of airborne and overhead assets, such as AWACS and Joint Stars. The place that doesn't grow going forward is global mobility, arguably the part that we would care about in this room. And why is that? Well, we're buying a new tanker, but we have stopped buying strategic airlift, in part because the Obama administration's rework of the war plans reduced the warfighting requirements for intercontinental lift. So most of the lift money that is in the Air Force budget is going to recapitalizing the Cold War C-130 force, which is, generally speaking, not an intercontinental range force. Global mobility, I would say, moves sideways. I remember when I was advising Boeing during their bid for the tanker, you know, it's like we had to get the people on the commercial side of the house to help the guys on the military side of the house to do the bid convincingly. And at least initially, their attitude was, hey, 15 planes a year, why do I care? I make 400. Well, that tells you that although we have a tanker program going, it is not a very big tanker program. It will take decades to recapitalize all those aged KC-135s that are out there in the force. And then finally, we come to the Department of the Army, which is in a world of hurt in this fiscal and strategic environment. Its two characteristic missions are maneuver warfare and stability operations. Maneuver warfare is very out of favor. We have a shrinking force. We're down 120,000 personnel active duty since the president took office because we got out of Iraq. And there's broad bipartisan opposition to boots on the ground. I mean, there's almost nothing left in Washington that's bipartisan, but one thing everybody can agree on is they don't want boots on the ground, okay? And then there's stability operations. The 2012 strategic guidance basically wrote extended stability operations out of the war plan. And so therefore, we're not planning to do it. Now, you know, someday some enemy will take a vote and we'll decide we got to do it, but we're not going to be prepared because at the moment, we're not spending any money on extended occupation capabilities. Next chart. Well, what about the non-traditional missions, the things that for the most part didn't even exist as major mission areas 20 years ago? There we see more robust demand signals. At the top of the chart, once again, some strategic missions, controlling weapons of mass destruction and counterterrorism. These will at least move sideways in the current strategic and fiscal environment. But turning mostly to the Army, counter-improvised explosive devices, once again, off a cliff. Why? Because if you're not going to put boots on the ground, you don't worry as much about force protection. So they have renamed the agency that used to have the lead for this mission and kind of moved it into the Witness Protection Program. You're not going to hear much from them for a long time. But all the other missions, the demand signals are pointed up. Special operations, because our controlling guidance right now stresses agility and a reduced footprint. Military assistance, because the guidance stresses support of overseas partners. If you want them to do more of their own fighting, then you have to equip them and train them. And humanitarian assistance is always in favor. It's politically popular, it bolsters the image of the military. Cyber defense, that next cluster there, something that General McDougall has been spending a lot of time on since he assumed his current command. This is all going to get more funding going forward. Even if it's not in the plan, you know it's going to be getting more funding because we have a significant cyber attack in this country every day. And, you know, I've been studying the military for 30 years. I can't ever remember a threat where you could suffer a major attack and not know a month later who attacked you. I mean, this is different. We've never been in a situation like this before, right? Network attack, our own offensive capabilities, that'll be getting more money. It's all classified, so I don't know how much. But the main issue there is whether us counterattacking will work or whether it will backfire given our own vulnerabilities. And then network exploitation has become a major emphasis in the intelligence community. This just basically means using the network to find out what the other side is doing. Unmanned systems, ISR and strike, not really a mission area, really a capability, but this is going to be robustly funded going forward. The Air Force demand will be steady. Army and Navy requirements will grow for ISR. Meanwhile, on the strike side, it's a valued alternative to in-country troop presence. In fact, I think you could probably say that almost all the terrorists that we have taken out recently during the Obama era were taken out by unmanned systems. It's relatively rare for us to use manned aircraft or forces on the ground to take these folks out now. We prefer using drones, and so I don't see the demand signal for that going down anytime soon. Next chart. Well, that brings me to the next part of this briefing, which is about the fiscal and political environment in which we find ourselves. Remember I said at the beginning, threats in politics drive demand for military goods and services. The politics is a problem for the foreseeable future. Even if the Budget Control Act remains law, annual deficits are now projected by the Congressional Budget Office to reach $1 trillion a year again, starting in 2024. What you see here are the latest numbers. I think they were released in September from the Congressional Budget Office, showing the mismatch between federal receipts and federal outlays. As you can see, we have a structural deficit. There's no point here at which the budget starts to see a shrinkage in the size of borrowing required to sustain our planned spending. Eliminating the structural deficit requires a 15 to 20% tax increase or an equivalent cut in spending. I am told that Donald Trump's tax plan entails reducing federal tax receipts by a quarter, so I'm not expecting these numbers to get any better in the next CBO projection. Next chart. Looking a little more closely at that deficit, the United States will, for the foreseeable future, even in the most optimistic calculations, be borrowing over $1 billion per day. Now, last year when I showed you these charts, the size of the deficit just went steadily upward. This year it looks slightly different because they're projecting 1 year in which it'll go down to the timing of payments, but that's really beside the point. If you look at the two blue bars at the bottom, in 2015, we're at 12% of the budget being covered by borrowing. By the end of the decade, we're pushing 16%. If you look at the share of the economy that is represented by the size of the borrowing, it's 2.5% at mid-decade, it's 3.3% at the end of the decade. This is what a structural deficit looks like, and that last bullet at the bottom tells you how serious this problem could become for us in the future. I told you last year we were going to hit $20 trillion cumulative debt in 2018. Well, I was wrong. We're going to hit it this year. They've moved up the projection on when it's going to happen. What does $20 trillion mean when you're carrying it and have to pay interest on it? It means that every time interest rates go up 1%, the government's debt bill for the year increases by $200 billion. So what happens if interest rates return from today's very low levels to historic rates? The government's bill, just to carry the debt it's already accumulated, could be $500, $600, $700 billion more per year. And this is why the question arises as to whether we can afford our current global strategy. Next chart. Now, it's no secret where these increases, where the deficit is being driven from. It's coming out of entitlement programs. Actually, the Congressional Budget Office projects that tax receipts will rise each year between now and 2026. The problem is they won't rise as fast as the spending does. Annual spending increases $2.4 trillion between 2016 and 2026, driven mainly by entitlement programs. Medicare and Medicaid go up by 80%, Social Security goes up by 77%. I want to make sure you understand what I'm saying to you. What I'm saying is between now and 10 years hence, the size of our budget is going to increase from $4 trillion to $6.4 trillion, just in a 10-year period. That's the projection based on current laws and fiscal trends. So that pie chart that you're seeing on your left there, that's not a pie chart of the budget, it's a pie chart of the increase. It shows you where the increases that are causing this budget to balloon at its current rate are coming from. And where they're coming from is, first of all, Medicare and Medicaid, followed by Social Security, followed by interest on the debt. The things that are not really driving the higher deficits are domestic discretionary and defense, because they are capped by the Budget Control Act. Spending on domestic and defense discretionary barely rises at all through the end of the decade. But spending on the debt, just carrying the debt we've accumulated, goes up for two different reasons. First of all, the debt gets bigger. It grows by $9 trillion over a 10-year period. But secondly, CBO thinks the interest rates are going to go up. And if the interest rates goes up, then you pay more money even on a static debt. So if your debt's increasing, it's like double jeopardy. Next page. Here's what it means for defense. The entitlements go up as a share of the economy. defense goes down. You can see, for example, Social Security goes from 5 to 6% of GDP over a 10-year period. But defense goes from 3.2% of the economy down to 2.7%. That is I believe that is the lowest percentage defense has claimed in my lifetime. And I've been alive for a while. The lowest we got, I believe, during the last year of Clinton, I think it was 2.9%. So this is sort of outside the range of experience for anybody in this room. Purchasing power of the defense budget doesn't actually go down. It's just capped. But because everything else is growing, entitlements, interest on the debt, and the overall economy, as a percentage of the economy, it becomes smaller and smaller. And that means it has less political significance at election time. Next page. So speaking of the politics, all right, we know that threats in politics drive defense, but threats by themselves can't drive defense spending unless the political system agrees to acknowledge that instability is spreading. And lately, our political system has been reluctant to do that. We're spending only 3.2% of a $19 trillion economy right now, only 15% of the federal budget. Look in the middle of the page to what the divergence in the trends since the last big military buildup for entitlements and defense. In 1986, the height of the Reagan defense buildup, we were spending 40% of a relatively small budget on entitlements. And today, we're spending 64% of a much bigger budget. Meanwhile, defense has gone from a third of our budget to less than $1.06. Now, why is that happening? Is it because threats have diminished? Well, not really. The reason it's happening is because voting behavior in America typically is influenced more by taxes and entitlements than by security concerns. The big divide in our politics is between those who are pro-tax, pro-entitlement, and those who are anti-tax, anti-entitlement. So politics is a struggle for power. You want to get reelected every 2 years if you're in the House of Representatives. What's going to get you more mileage in terms of being reelected? Spending money on new entitlements or spending money on defense? Probably new entitlements. Defense is a sideshow in this struggle for power. Next chart. I guess it won't come as a big surprise to you if I say that partisan division has paralyzed Washington. The Congress has failed to deliver a complete federal budget by the September 30th deadline for a very long time. Now, let me tell you what I mean by that. I have 19-year-old twins attending Auburn and Penn State right now. Before I covered up my smartphone home screen with apps, I used to have a picture of them graduating from high school. And I would show it to people and I would say, when's the last time in these kids' lifetime that the federal government has actually delivered a complete budget in time for the new fiscal year? The answer is never, not once in their entire life. The last time that the federal government actually completed a budget in time for the new fiscal year was fiscal 1997, and it was delivered just before they were born. We have had continuing resolutions for 16 straight years. And even though we had an October 2015 budget deal that we thought was going to do a little bit to fix the situation, it didn't, because the long-term outlook remains unchanged. Political paralysis is likely to persist because support for political parties is evenly split in the electorate. I mean, I know watching this current race, it's hard to tell what's going on, but if you look at the underlying numbers, basically, there's about as many people who support the Democrats as there are who support the Republicans. And so the system is split almost evenly in terms of the way people cast their votes. So looking forward to the election, Republicans will probably hold the House and lose the Senate. It's just a kind of a statistical probability thing because there's so many Republican senators up for re-election. That means that no matter who gets elected president, we're still going to have a divided government. We're still going to have gridlock. And you can see on these three little pie charts here how frustrated the electorate is about that. President Obama has 51% approval, which is pretty close to the highest level he's enjoyed in his second term. It's not so much that he's unpopular as that the country's just divided. In terms of Congress, the country appears to hate the Congress. Almost 4 out of 5 voters say they don't approve of the job that Congress is doing. And in terms of the direction of the country, we've had about 2/3 of voters, of respondents, saying we're on the wrong track here. So you would think this would lead to a sea change in the election, but it won't, because the country's evenly divided on why Congress is doing a bad job or why we're on the wrong track. There's no agreement on what we need to do to fix this problem. Unfortunately, unless one party or the other gets control of everything in Washington, we don't appear capable of breaking out of the gridlock. Next chart. Now, the good news is that both of these parties do support defense. That, you know, the Vietnam era is kind of behind us as far as anti-war sentiment is concerned. But there is a significant difference between these two parties in terms of what it means to support defense. To put it succinctly, if you get a Republican in the White House or Republicans in control of the Senate, weapons spending goes up. If you get a Democrat, it goes down. I mean, that's an oversimplification, but go check the numbers. That's what happens. And so you get a pattern such as the one that I've depicted in this graphic here. Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, defense spending goes down. Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush, not defense spending, weapons spending. Weapons spending goes down. George W. Bush or Ronald Reagan, weapons spending goes up. Now, it's not that Democrats are anti-defense, but when they're in control of the system, they prefer to spend defense money on readiness and on people. And so you get this very strong correlation between which party controls the government and whether weapons spending goes up or down. President Obama has followed the usual Democratic pattern on defense of generating savings mainly from cutting weapons. I mean, it's really quite striking. Almost all the defense savings the administration generated during its first term were from weapons accounts. During its second term, it predicted and has followed through on generating 2/3 of all the savings under the Budget Control Act from what we call the investment accounts, basically the weapons accounts. Next page. So there's this other problem we're facing that is relatively new in terms of sustaining a coherent defense posture. As Congress has become more partisan, it has also become less knowledgeable on defense matters. There is not a single defense expert left in the leadership of either political party in either chamber of commerce. The only guy we ever hear from is Senator McCain, and he's not in the leadership. The percent of veterans in each chamber is at historic lows. If you look at the pie chart on your left, you can see that in 1980, when Ronald Reagan was elected, 2 out of 3 members of Congress were veterans. Today, we're down to 1 in 5. And then there's this other companion problem, which is that the percentage of legislators elected in 2010 or later is nearly 1 in 2, 49%. So that means it's not just that they don't understand defense very well, they don't even understand the legislative process very well. All the old war horses that we would count on to get defense bills passed, Ted Stevens, the Daniel Inouye's, the Ike Skeltons, the Jack Murthas, they're all gone. They're all gone. So what happens when you don't have any personal experience with the military and you're not really very, very well tutored on the intricacies of this legislative process? Well, what happens is that you default to ideology in many of your choices. That's why, for example, the members of the Freedom Caucus want the Budget Control Act to stay in effect. Do they want a strong defense? Yes, they do. But the Pentagon is awash in waste, so using the Budget Control Act is a way of holding the military's feet to the fire on efficiency. Donald Trump says the same thing. Okay, obviously this is not what you would call a deep and nuanced understanding of the military. But that's what we have when people don't really know the subject matter well. Next chart. I figured I had to throw in one chart on the election, so here it is. I'm not going to make any predictions here. In this current environment, anybody who makes a prediction is a fool, at least if they're betting money. But what I've done here on the right-hand side of the page is I've compared the vote counts in 2012 as they're aggregated by the Electoral College and as they actually were county by county, who won each of these counties. We have here an unusual situation where a majority of voters view both candidates unfavorably. That's never happened before in presidential polling. As of late October, Clinton led Trump in all of the national polls. I think she's still ahead in most of them, but it is neck and neck. However, the popular vote matters less to the outcome than state by state, because that's the way the Electoral College vote is aggregated. You know, when Donald Trump says the system is rigged, he is right in at least one way. The founding fathers set this thing up so that it would not be direct popular vote of the president. The votes are aggregated state by state. And so you see Barack Obama, if I recall correctly, won by like 3% in the popular vote in 2012. But if you look at his electoral count, he had over 300 electoral college votes versus barely 200 for Romney. In other words, the electoral college vote comes out significantly different from what these national tracking polls would imply. I think what that tells us is that 2016 will likely be a repeat of 2012. Clinton is doing well in almost all the states, all the swing states that Obama carried in 2012. And maybe she might lose Ohio, she might lose Florida, but I think once you look at this through the lens of the Electoral College vote, she wins. That's my guess, but I'm not putting any money on that. Next chart. So let's move on to how just a few charts here on how the defense industry has dealt with this prolonged downturn in defense demand. I'm talking about the big system integrators, because that's mainly who I deal with. With overseas wars winding down and military spending capped, the biggest contractors have adopted defensive strategies. On the left-hand side of the page, you see arrayed in descending order of revenues, the top 7 military contractors, and then across the top of the page, the generic moves that they make when they're faced with soft demand. Divest underperformers, acquire niche defense, major share buybacks, increasing foreign sales, and growing commercial revenues. Some of these companies like Lockheed and BAE are trying everything. Others like Boeing, a little more focused, they are mainly working on getting up their foreign military sales and their commercial sales. But the interesting thing that has happened in this downturn is that there's been a run-up in share prices for all these companies. And because stockholders are not in any pain, there's very little pressure for consolidation. Next chart. Here's why they're worried about consolidation. Just a little historic factoid. When procurement spending went down at the end of the Cold War by 2/3, so did the number of major defense contractors. When's the last time you heard the name Litton Industries or Westinghouse? 2/3 of them pulled out of the sector. So it is hypothetically possible the sector could consolidate going forward, but there's little sign so far today that the existing downturn will create a similar realignment. Next chart. The one place where we are seeing some significant merger and acquisition activity is in services, for the simple reason that services is a short cycle market segment that responds more quickly than hardware makers to demand signals. The big system integrators, they're not sure what they're going to do with their services operations, but the pure play service players are consolidating fairly rapidly. They're seeking economies of scale in a fragmented market. Some of them, like Leidos, would like to have a more diverse business mix. And so you can see in the chart here that we had a peak in M&A activity for defense services in 2015. It is conceivable that this will be a harbinger of where hardware makers are headed, but not yet, because of this one last chart I want to show you about the defense industry and where it stands. Next page. I call this my what's wrong with this picture chart, all right? It's the defense downturn, right? So explain this. Over the previous 4 years, sales per share for the biggest defense pure plays have gone up by single digits. Shares for earnings on their shares have gone up by double digits, and their share prices have gone up by triple digits. Some downturn. The only reason Northrop Grumman looks like it's up by more than single digits on the sales per share side is because it bought back a quarter of its shares. And that had an effect on the statistics. But you wouldn't believe what's happened with the share price of these companies. Northrop Grumman's share price is up 600% since Bob Gates said he was cutting about a third of our big ticket weapons systems. Raytheon, General Dynamics, they're up by over 300%. Now, This is not what a downturn is supposed to look like. There's three reasons, I think, why share prices have defied fundamentals. First of all, the Federal Reserve has these ridiculously low interest rates, which were designed to force people out of bank deposits and into equities, and they have worked. Secondly, the companies have been very good at cost cutting. They have gotten rid of facilities, they've gotten rid of people, they've pared almost all of their discretionary spending, like marketing and research, and that has enabled them to raise dividends even though they're facing static to declining revenues domestically. And then finally, we have these big share buybacks, Northrop being the biggest. Apparently, Wall Street loves this stuff. You cut your shares by 25 to 30%, and your stock price goes up by a couple of 100%. Pretty amazing. Now, every year I say to myself, can they continue doing this? Is it possible this strategy will continue working in a downturn? Well, all I can tell you is that large cap defense stocks have outperformed in 8 of the last 10 presidential election years, so they may very well do the same thing this year. And that brings me to my last 3 charts. Next chart, please, which is about the transportation environment. I said to you earlier that I'm not really a transportation expert. I really deal mostly with the big system integrators, but I don't think you need to be an expert on this sector to see some of the things that are going on there. I mean, you'd have to be pretty dense not to see them. Transcom is being stressed by a series of emerging threats. Maybe the most important one over the long run, the one that General McDougall has spoken to recently, is the fact that the generation when we didn't have to worry about our strategic lines of communication being interdicted, or about attrition in our transportation fleet, I think that period is probably over. We're going to be facing some mighty serious transport and logistics threats going forward from some of these emerging challengers. We also, more broadly, have proliferating threats that lead to diverse logistics needs in multiple theaters. We have these chronic and growing cyber problems that pose a threat to both our military and our civilian networks. We have the fiscal uncertainties I've alluded to earlier, the CRs, the budget caps, which limit the logistics spend. And then the commercial side of the house is now going into a very substantial reordering, a consolidation, because of what has happened with trade and what has happened with commodities over the last several years. Fiscal and threat pressures are going to force more reliance on partners. Now, I know we said that last year, but we were right. The role of the reserve component in transport is going to grow. Transcom will depend even more on commercial providers. The question is, with all of these cross currents in the marketplace, whether the commercial sector will be able to come forward as robustly as in past emergencies. I mean, for example, we've got a pilot shortage because the Middle East airlines are trying to bring in a lot of new pilots. We've got truckers dropping out because of high interest rates and because of high premium rates and low trucking rates. So, this system is rationalizing, and that could be a problem down the road in a national emergency. Next chart. I'll just go through this quickly to observe that a lot of the traditional carriers that did come to the military's assistance in emergencies have disappeared or been absorbed into other enterprises. We see massive change evidence across all transport sectors. Northwest, Continental, US Air, they're all gone. Amazon is assembling its own logistics networks. You know what's happening with the railroads because of declining oil and coal transport. And we have, as I said earlier, the high premiums, the low rates, which are starting to force truckers out of the business. They're certainly forcing a lot of consolidation on truckers. So turning to my last chart here, let's go back and look at that map of Eurasia that I started with. In each of the major theaters where the United States might be at war in the next several years, and the Army thinks it is going to be at war within the next 5 years against a peer or near-peer threat, we face major logistics and transport challenges. In Eastern Europe, we have limited sea access. This is not like fighting on the Central Front or Western Europe. In Eastern Europe, you've got major geographical access issues. Nobody is going to put an aircraft carrier in the Black Sea or the Baltic Sea unless they don't need the aircraft carrier anymore. We have vulnerable bases and pre-positioning. We have mismatched rail gauges. You get to the border of Poland and all of a sudden your rolling stock doesn't work anymore. You got border crossing impediments. and you've got cyber attacks that will probably be pervasive in any war. Middle East and Central Asia, you got extended supply lines, uncertain base access, people aren't certain they want us around. You got pervasive corruption, as we've learned all too well. You got green on blue violence, and then you've got all these cultural barriers that get in the way of operating efficiently. And finally, in the Western Pacific, again, extended supply lines, vulnerable sea approaches, vulnerable bases in PREPO, and those cyber attacks. Now, with enough money, we could fix most of these problems. We could fix most of these problems. There's one problem, though, that money can't fix. For the foreseeable future, every threat we face is going to have a geographical advantage over us. In other words, they are all going to be operating closer to their home bases than we are. And that's why we know that logistics and transport is going to be crucial to our success, because we're going to be far from home and they aren't. Thank you. Do I have time for even one question? Okay. Sir.
Well, I've got, knowing we were going to be down to one, I had a large list to kind of pick from, so I'll go with this one. If the president-elect, say, weekend after Thanksgiving, were to invite you either to Chappaqua or up to the penthouse in Manhattan.
Someplace in New York.
Someplace in New York, yes, sir. And he said, bring along that timeline chart where you put all kind of the military and the strategic surprises on it. And go, by the way, will you populate the next 5 to 10 years for me with what you think might be on that chart? What would you do?
Now, military planning isn't, a strategy of hope. You plan for what you think could happen that you have to be ready for. I would say the first thing I would put on that chart is war with Russia next year. Now, the Army's estimate is that it will face war with Russia sometime in the next 5 years, but sometime in the next 5 years means it could happen next year. And the reason it could happen next year mainly is that it is typical for enemies to challenge new administrations before they get their feet on the ground. For example, the Cuban Missile Crisis. So you have to plan on the assumption that we could have a major conflict in Eastern Europe. Now, this presents us with all sorts of very serious problems, because we're talking about a nuclear-armed adversary. It even has an edge in theater nuclear weapons that it says in its doctrine it could use if it thinks it's losing in Eastern Europe. But having said that, we either do something about a Russian invasion of Ukraine or the Baltic states, or we simply concede Eastern Europe to the Russians again, and that could very well lead to the unraveling of NATO, our most important alliance. So certainly the first thing on that map, I think, going forward of the future, that roadmap, the first place where I would say, look out, is Eastern Europe and the Russians. It's pretty clear what Putin wants to do here. It's not clear what we will do in response. And a lot of that will be about logistics and transport, because we really don't have a capability to deal with that threat right now. I just met with the Army General in Command in Europe. I just had dinner with him 3 weeks ago, and he says, I'm trying hard to make 30,000 troops look like 300,000. We just don't have enough there to stop them unless we just force stuff into the theater real quick. And that'll be quite a transport challenge given all the difficulties I illuminated earlier. Going beyond that, we know cyber is not going to go away. I'm not all that concerned about the Pacific at the moment, but you don't have to be a student of politics to know something is going to happen in the Middle East. I would tell the new president, though, decide what it is that you want to do about the Middle East, because so far everything you've tried has been a disaster. For 30 years, nothing has worked well, so what are you going to do about it? It's easy to say, I've washed my hands of the Middle East. But have you thought about what happens when the Chinese decide to take your place there and protecting the oil? How are you going to feel about that? So it's something that requires some reflection. I think I'm done.